Hello and welcome to the Admech series, the series where we look at all things Admech. In this video, I wanted to take a look at a very interesting list, and a list that is a veteran cohort, as we haven't taken a look at one of those lists yet. This list is rather interesting, and we'll see quickly why that is. This list came in 15th place out of 81 players, and while that doesn't sound particularly impressive, do keep in mind that coming in 15th place out of 81 players means this list won 3 games, drew 1 game in a very high scoring game, and had 1 loss total out of the 5 rounds that it played. So clearly that's quite impressive as a record and shows that this list could have very easily qualified in a much higher standing had that 1 loss been a little more favorable in terms of points. And in some cases there are certain missions that can go very poorly depending on how a matchup plays out, so there's definitely allowances for that. This list was piloted by a player named Matt Woodhouse, and it was played on June 4th in the London Open hosted in the United Kingdom. And before we get into the list itself, let's take a quick look at what the Veteran Cohort does, as we haven't covered it in this channel before. The Veteran Cohort is an army of renown, meaning that it comes with certain restrictions and benefits as an army. The Army of Renown is actually one of the least restrictive armies of renown that I've seen, so let's begin by looking at the restrictions. The restrictions begin with saying that you may only have Skitarii units in your army, except for one of each HQ-style Tech Priest. This means that you pretty much have the entirety of the Codex available to you, except for the Cataphrone units, the Castellans, the Electro Priests, and the Datasmith. That's a very small thing to give up, considering that the only loss you're really getting in exchange for all of the benefits is really those Castellan robots, now that they have been buffed significantly due to points reductions. Outside of that restriction, the other restriction you have is that all of the units must be from the same Forge World, which once again becomes a rather moot point due to match play requirements saying that all detachments must be from the same subfaction in a recent rules change. Now there are 2 additional restrictions, both tied to the Skitarii Marshal unit. The restrictions are that each detachment must include a Skitarii Marshal within it, which isn't too bad considering that the Skitarii Marshal does work very well with what this Army of Renown has to offer. In addition to that, your Warlord must be a Skitarii Marshal. Now that's a bit of a detriment, as it does make your Warlord a little more fragile than choosing one of the Tech Priests that you're allowed to include within your army, though at the end of the day it's not the end of the world and it's still a perfectly fine choice in many situations. With the restrictions being covered, let's take a look at the benefits you gain for going into this Army of Renown. Like all armies of renown, you gain extra traits, relics, and stratagems for going into a specific subfaction, and in addition to that, Rangers and Vanguard become veteran versions of their initial style, which increases the point cost of each individual model by 2 points per model. In addition to that, for every 10 models you have within a unit, it increases the power level by 1, which can play a little bit into strategic reserves. However, in exchange for being veterans, the Rangers and Vanguard gain quite a lot of different benefits, as both the Rangers and Vanguard gain +1 to their leadership and +1 to their attack profile, as well as their invulnerable save going up to a total of 5+, which does make them a lot more tankier than they would first appear at first glance. This gives them quite a lot of durability and really helps them stand out in comparison to a lot of other troops within other armies. On top of this, the Rangers and Vanguard gain some additional special benefits to their respective profiles. The Rangers gain the Stealth Optimization ability that says if the unit doesn't move, advance, or fall back, it gains the benefits of light cover, which does add to that durability even further by increasing its normal save. The Vanguard, on the other hand, gain the Skirmish Optimization, which allows them to roll an additional d6 for advanced rolls and discard one of the dice rolled. They also ignore the Blast rule for having 6 or more models within their unit. All of these different abilities that the Vanguard and the Rangers gain are all incredibly powerful and incredibly beneficial to the models themselves, and for the low cost of 2 points per model, it's definitely a valuable trade-off to make, especially considering how little restrictions you see on the army in itself. Now that we know what the Army of Renown restrictions and benefits are, we can begin looking at the army list itself. This army list is composed of a Forge World that we haven't seen before, being the Ryza Forge World, and this army consists of a single battalion detachment. If you're interested in learning more about the Ryza Forge World, I'll link the video I did specifically on them in the description below, though to give a quick rundown of what the Ryza Forge World brings to the table in terms of static abilities for the entire army, all units with the Ryza Forge World keyword gain the Red in Cog and Claw ability, which offers 2 benefits, the first one being when units with this ability make melee attacks, if that unit was charged, or heroically intervened, you add 1 to the attack's wound roll, which does help the model's wound considering that some of the melee units within an Admech force can have a somewhat low strength profile. The second benefit that the Ryza Forge World offers is that you add 1 to the charge roll of units with this dogma. And as I always say, a melee unit that fails its charge roll fails all of its attacks and is usually stranded out in the open for your opponent to shoot at. As such, making your charge roll is one of the most important things that you can do with a melee unit. With that being covered, let's take a look at what's included in this army list itself. As all battalion detachments do, this army list begins with its HQ choices, and the first HQ choice is a Skitarii Marshal, being the warlord of this army as the restrictions require him to be. This Skitarii Marshal has been given a relic and a trait. The warlord trait for the Skitarii Marshal is the Calculate Without Diversions, found in the second Warzone Caradon book, known as the Book of Fire, which contains the rules for the Veteran Cohort Army of Renown. This warlord trait isn't spectacularly anything amazing, but it does allow you to reduce the command point cost of various Veteran Cohort stratagems, and as you'll soon see, this list is very command point hungry, and as such, command point reduction of different stratagems does benefit the list in terms of the consistency of how it plays throughout different turns and how it has access to different stratagems as it plays throughout the game. As for the relic is the Exemplars Eternity, and as for the Exemplars Eternity relic, this relic is very ubiquitous on Skitarii Marshals when large units of Skitarii are involved, as it allows the Skitarii units to roll a lot more than they would normally do with the basic abilities of the Skitarii Marshal, and it essentially makes him better than the Dominus in situations where he's paired with large blocks of Rangers or Vanguard. Now moving on to the second HQ choice of this army list, the second HQ choice is yet another Skitarii Marshal, being given an extra trait and an extra relic. The trait that the Skitarii Marshal has been given is the Eyes of the Omniscient. The Eyes of the Omniscient say that core units within 9 inches of the bearer of this trait, or a unit with a data tether anywhere on the table, can reroll the advance or charge roll until your next command phase. This is very good for melee units because, once again, it really does help them move across the board, get into position for a charge, and then make that charge successfully, with the benefits of the Ryza Forge World being added into that role. Thus, it gives you a lot more consistency and really does help out your melee units. As for the relic that the Skitarii Marshal has been given, he's been given the Cantic Thrallnet from the Book of Fire, which says you can select a core unit within 9 inches of the bearer, and it has an additional Doctrina active of your choice, and that Doctrina can be one that has already been used and does not prevent you from using that Doctrina in future turns. The Cantic Thrallnet is definitely a very powerful relic, and you'll pretty much see it included within every Veteran Cohort, as it's very useful and very powerful, giving you the ability to really make full use of those Doctrinas so that you can consistently use the one that is most beneficial to you within a given circumstance. After the first two Skitarii Marshals, there is a third HQ choice, being a Tech Priest Manipulus. This Manipulus has been given a Holy Order, being the Logai Holy Order, which in its first mode reduces the armor penetration of enemies, allowing him to protect a unit while also buffing them with his innate abilities. And if you ever need more offensive capabilities, the Logai can switch over to its second half, which allows you to ignore cover bonuses for enemy units when shooting at them with the selected unit. As for the additional relic, the Manipulus has been given a Raiment of a Technomartyr, which is a very popular relic from the basic codex. This relic gives him a 5+ Feel No Pain, and allows him to select a friendly unit and allow that unit to ignore any hit and ballistic modifiers to their shooting attacks. This is once again very powerful and shows that he's most likely going to be accompanying a large unit of Skitarii warriors of some type, and the reduction of the armor penetration goes very well with the additional survivability capabilities of the veteran units within the Skitarii Veteran Cohort forces. There is one additional HQ style unit in this situation, being a non-force organization slot, which is a Tech Priest Engine Seer, as this Engine Seer uses his Brotherhood of the Cog ability to get around the HQ restrictions, and this Engine Seer is a buff unit, being given a Holy Order and an additional Warlord trait. The Holy Order that he has been given is the Magi Holy Order, which in its primary mode allows him to give a unit +2 to their advance roll. And as for the trait, it is Citation in Savagery. This is a special Ryza trait, and it says a core unit within 6 inches of the bearer gains +1 armor penetration within the fight phase. So as the Engine Seer is a bit of a melee unit in himself, and he has these two different special abilities granted to him, he is most likely going to be accompanying some kind of melee unit, thus furthering the ability of a Ryza melee unit to move up the table, and then helping its armor penetration once they find themselves engaged with an enemy within melee combat. And with that being said, that covers all of the HQ choices for this battalion detachment. With HQ choices covered, we can move on to the troop choices for this battalion detachment. As a battalion detachment, this is going to include quite a few different troop choices, with the first two troop choices being 2 large blocks of Skitarii Rangers. Each of these large blocks includes 18 Skitarii Rangers, with the only upgrade for the unit being an Omnispecs. These two units are definitely very respective in their ability to survive, thanks to the different Veteran Cohort abilities, as well as with the different Manipulus abilities, and their firepower can be incredibly improved with the Manipulus and the Skitarii Marshal, thus making them an incredibly potent threat against pretty much any enemies with their heavy mid-range firepower that can be even further augmented with the different stratagems that they have access to. After the first two units of the Skitarii Rangers, this battalion detachment includes 3 units of 5 Vanguard. These Vanguard have been given no upgrades, however I'll mention that it's rather amusing as the army list has them written down as having 5 arc rifles within the unit. This is obviously a mistake as they are armed with radium carbines based on the unit size and the point cost of the entire unit. However, it would have been rather cool if you had the option to have a 5-man unit equipped with special weapons, and it would definitely allow you to build a very elite army early on so that you don't have to include as many models, though it would be a very fragile and glass cannon army, so it wouldn't be very advised in the long term, but it would be a fun thing to do until you can build up additional models and then disperse those arc rifles or plasma calibers throughout the different units as you slowly build out your army, and it would definitely be an interesting solution to the question of how do you make more elite armies without necessarily changing the units. And it would be interesting to see if there was such a thing where you could take all special weapons on a 5-man squad and then see how it plays out, as it would give you more diversity within army builds as well. However, as it stands, that's not the reality, and that's just a little bit of an interesting musing that I had when I was looking at that little bit of an amusing mistake on the army list reporting. And after covering those 5 troop choices, that's the extent of the troop choices within this army. Moving on, we come to the elite choices for this battalion detachment. And this battalion detachment has included 3 different elite choices, being 3 units of 10 Ruststalkers each. And 2 of these units of Sicarian Ruststalkers have been given relics on their Princeps units, and the third one is just a generic unit of 10 Ruststalkers. All 3 units have been armed with the Transonic Blades, which are a rather nice weapon that benefits from a higher armor penetration rating and can do quite a lot of damage even through Armor of Contempt. Not only that, but the Ruststalkers having a rather low strength profile do also benefit from the additional wound benefits on the Ryza army-wide rules, and on top of that, they also benefit from the charge bonus of Ryza as well, meaning that they're gaining quite a lot of benefit from being within the Ryza Forge world. So let's take a look at those different relics that the 2 units have been given. The first unit of Ruststalkers has been given the Temporacopia, that allows this unit to select one enemy within 3 inches and make that enemy fight last within combat, definitely allowing the Ruststalkers to get the first strike advantage, which is a very useful ability to have. The second relic that the Ruststalkers have been given is the Omniscient Mask. The Omniscient Mask is another melee benefiting relic that says melee attacks score an additional hit when an unmodified 6 is rolled for their hit roll, thus allowing the Ruststalkers to have that increased output. Now, if those Ruststalkers are accompanied by that Engine Seer, their deadliness goes up even more. Maybe even that second Skitarii Marshal can join them, as he has rather melee beneficial abilities, though it's interesting to say that with the additional point of attack on the veteran units in the Rangers and Vanguard, there's definitely some argument to be made that even they benefit from the Ryza abilities, because all of a sudden they have that additional bit of deadliness thanks to those different benefits that kind of add up over time and allow them to be a much bigger threat within melee than a lot of players would be used to when engaging on units such as that. And at some point, even without a high armor penetration, the sheer volume of melee attacks from one of those large ranger units can definitely put a dent in a lot of enemy units simply with an overwhelming amount of number of attacks, and that's an interesting thing to point out, as you can definitely catch some players off guard with something like that. Now, moving on from the elite choice, let's take a look at the fast attack choices for this army list. This list includes 3 different fast attack choices, and they're all rather basic choices. The first one being a unit of 6 sterilizers, which can drop down very effectively to clean out some swarm units with their flamers, can take an objective, perform actions, and can be a bit of a nuisance within melee thanks to their melee capabilities due to their Talon melee weapon. And as such, they do benefit from the Ryza special abilities, though maybe not quite as massively as the Ruststalkers do. Then the second 2 fast attack choices are 2 units of 3 Cerberus Raiders each, and that's another great unit to gain some board presence, as well as be a bit of an annoyance for your opponent, whether they're just moving around the table and being a nuisance, or if they're screening for your different units, such as those Rangers in certain games. Now, with all that being covered, this list does not include any heavy support choices, which is rather ironic considering it's an Admech army which should include quite a few of them. Though with that being said, this list does include 2 flyer units, which is the maximum you're allowed within a 2000 point game. Both these flyer units are an Archaeopter Fusilier. These Fusiliers have been armed with a command uplink and have not been given a chaff launcher due to the points limitations within the list. The Fusiliers are definitely great units that can generate quite a lot of mortal wounds throughout the course of the game, and the Fusilier and Stratoraptor do still see plenty of play within different Admech lists, so they should definitely not be discounted when considering what kind of army you want to build, because even though they've seen a bit of a points increase, they still have enough firepower and ability to deal damage to your opponents and be an overall pain to them that they're definitely a perfectly fine and perfectly valid inclusion within any Admech force. So with the whole list being covered, let's discuss this list a little bit more in depth. The interesting things about this list is that while it's a Ryza list, it does not go all in with the melee theme by doing something like including a bunch of Dragoons or by going overly heavy within different melee choices. Instead, it chooses to go with a decent mix of different type of units, such as the Skitarii Rangers, which can put out quite a lot of mid-range firepower, and the different skirmish units within the fast attack choice, and the main melee forces for this army are those 3 units of Rust Stalkers. Additionally, this list does not have a particularly large amount of heavy firepower. In fact, it pretty much doesn't have any anti-armor firepower at all, considering it doesn't include anything like the Iron Striders or the Stratoraptor. Instead, it chooses to go for a lot more of a mid-range build, with a couple of Fusiliers to give it some mortal wound capabilities, and hopes to overpower enemies with a sheer volume of firepower, and the different abilities that it can stack on its different units that can really increase the deadliness of some of the different shooting attacks. Though we'll say a list like this will probably struggle against Imperial Knights, as it might have some difficulty with dealing with some of those different Knights, as well as the Knights being able to clear out quite a lot of its smaller units with the overwhelming firepower that the Knights can provide in those circumstances. The other thing I'll mention is that do notice this list includes quite a lot of additional relics and warlord traits, meaning that it's going to be using quite a lot of command points before the game has even begun, which can be a little bit of an issue considering that there are many rumors that Games Workshop is going to be reducing the amount of command points you start off with to about 6 or 7. So if you look at this list, it includes an additional 6 relics and warlord traits past the first ones that it gets on its warlord. This means if the command points are reduced to a total of 6, you'll be starting off the game with 0 command points, except for the ones that you may gain on the first turn. That's definitely a difficult situation to find yourself in, as you'll be struggling to find those command points. However, do notice that with Calculate Without Diversion and the 2 different Holy Orders, you definitely buy back some of those command points through the different command point reductions that you gain from those different abilities. So that'll definitely smooth out the ability for this list to play out throughout the course of a game. In addition to that, if you're gaining more command points throughout the different turns with the new rules changes, that might also smooth out how this army plays, as there's only so many stratagems that you're going to be using within any given turn on those different units, as a lot of them can be self-sufficient without having to invest heavy amounts of command points to make them more effective, as the different stacking buffs from the different traits and relics do kind of cover some of the different command point benefits that you can gain. Though it's definitely something that you're going to have to be very conscious of when playing the game, as there can be a lot of different situations where you might find yourself very tight on command points, and that's definitely something hard to get used to, especially if you're used to playing an army that's very heavy in command points. And finally, to kind of wrap up this video, I want to say that take a look at this army list and take a look at what's included in it, as many of the choices within the army have kind of fallen out of favor, such as those different raiders and fusiliers, as I've been seeing less and less play within different Admech builds, though that's not to say they're completely out of the meta. And more so, the way that this army list is built is it doesn't go overly heavy on the melee choices, as previously mentioned, though it does bring kind of an oddball Forge World, being the Forge World of Ryza. All in all, I think it uses a very standard core for the Admech forces, but does innovate on top of that core to give itself some more ability to do things that other army lists might not be able to. And I definitely think this should show you that there are definitely a lot of ways to innovate and use your models in different and creative ways that people maybe have not thought about, considering that a lot of the Mars and Lucius lists that we traditionally see have not been performing particularly well within different tournaments, and all of a sudden the lists that we do see performing incredibly well are things like the defense cohort lists that were seen as not particularly viable previous to their placements within different tournaments, and all of a sudden we're seeing a list like this that utilizes a Forge World such as Ryza that hasn't seen much play and utilizes it to quite a good amount of success. So do always remember that learning from what people are playing within the meta is always a good place to start, that you can innovate on top of a list, and with how complex Warhammer 40k is, it's always important to understand that it's not as easy as taking a meta list and simply playing it, because you do really have to know how your army performs and how your army is going to perform in certain matches because as mentioned previously, the biggest thing that hurts this list in terms of placing is a single round where it scored rather poorly, meaning that that's the matchup it wants to focus on the most in terms of figuring out how to beat it with the resources that it has. Anyways, as always, thank you for watching, and as always, I want to give a big shout out to my patrons. You guys are really awesome people and really do help support the channel. In addition to that, I would like to say, if you know anyone who may benefit from this content, please do share this video with them, as it not only helps the channel, but it also helps them out as well. And if you've enjoyed the content, do subscribe and like for future videos from this channel. Thank you for watching and have a great day. Bye.